Dean, the question about God's relationship to time, is God timeless or temporal, is to me one of the most fundamental probative questions that we can ask about God. Whether you believe in God or not, it helps you to understand what that concept would mean. How do you see the problem?
I suppose this shows that I'm a philosopher, not a theologian, because I immediately start thinking, well, what's the nature of time? And if you have different views about the nature of time, I think this is going to put constraints on how timeless or temporal you're going to think that God is. So it's very common these days for philosophers and physicists to think of the universe as a spatiotemporal whole, a big four-dimensional block. It's got three spatial dimensions. It's got one temporal dimension. Relativity tells us that these are sort of weirdly, tied up to one another in kind of funny ways. But it's a four-dimensional manifold anyway. And relativity makes us doubt whether there's a special kind of spotlight of nowness that's lighting up part of the block and sort of moving through it. I still sort of believe in that, something like that. But if you don't, if you just think there's this whole and one dimension is temporal, I think it's much easier to suppose that God just sits outside of it, right, and sort of regards the whole as a whole. Without being enmeshed in the flow of time.
So the critical question is there a singular now that passes through and is only existent at one instant, so to speak?
Right.
And that critical analysis, so-called A time or B time. And
right. So the A theory of time, we get these horrible, boring labels from McTaggart. But he was a good enough philosopher that we just take his labels. But the A theory of time says there is an objective distinction out there in the world between the present and the past and the future.
Which is the common intuition that we all have.
It certainly comes naturally to us, I think.
And the B time?
Is the big block, right?
Okay.
And whenever we make distinctions between now or the present and past and future, we're dividing things up subjectively.
So in the B time, then you can have God, if you like, sitting outside this block. It's sort of a natural, conclusion to say.
Now you don't have to.
Right.
You're not forced to. You could say no. God is temporal, has different properties at different times, and so on. But you can think of. You've got all these locations in the block, and then you think of atemporal reality as sort of like a point or a time that's off the charts,
right,
so to speak. It's not even on there. Now, if you've got the A theory of time, well, there's different versions of it. So the question for the A theorist is, what's the nature of this big distinction between the present, and the past, and the future? I like the idea that well, this conversation is real, and past conversations that we've had, or future ones, just aren't in the most fundamental sense. They're like merely possible worlds, merely possible stories that will occur or have occurred, but they just don't exist.
So then if you believe this, and your God is in the A theory, that God really has these instant moments like you and I do, and the past is past to God, the future doesn't exist?
It's very hard to see how that could not be true on this picture. I mean, you might say, well, to talk about what God timelessly is doing is sort of like talking about what we will be doing or did do, and it doesn't imply anything about what he's doing now. On the other hand, you want to be able to say that God exists, right? And if you believe in God, and if you talk about what was the case or what will be the case, I can talk about Alexander the Great's horse Bucephalus. I can say there was such a thing without implying that he exists in the most basic sense.
Sure.
And if I say timelessly, God, blah, 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 well, does that imply that God exists? Or is timelessly existing kind of like existing in a story? You don't want to say that. So you want to say God doesn't just timelessly exist, where that's something like he used to exist or he will exist. You want to say he exists in the most fundamental way. And in that case, you seem to be sort of stuck saying that he exists and there's things true of him now. So,
okay, so let's take that assumption, which is a common assumption I think most people would accept. Now what do you do at the Big Bang, assuming that there was one Big Bang, and that is the moment when space and time is created, because they're one. So what do you do with your God prior to him, her, it having created the Big Bang?
Well, if that really was the creation of time, then prior doesn't make sense. I mean, it makes sense to ask what was going on prior,
right.
But the answer is nothing, because there were no earlier moments. Now, I mean, I think the best thing for the person who thinks that God's in time and that there was a beginning to creation, so that there were first things, that were the first contingent things that ever appeared, the first things in addition to God. You should suppose that there was time, in some sense, before that God existed prior to that, but minutes weren't ticking away, seconds weren't ticking away. God was, but there were no laws of nature that would govern things like clocks.
So there was sort of a time, a God's time, but there was no ability to measure the time?
Right, right. Sometimes our sense of time gets all wobbly, right? And things seem to take longer to you than to me. And it was sort of. Sometimes we're tempted to say, well, there's no fact of the matter about how long the period was. It was long to you, it was short to me. There's no, I mean, as a matter of fact, we can divide up periods of our time very precisely using clocks and so on. But if there weren't any clocks, and there couldn't even be any clocks, then maybe long and short doesn't really apply.
What about the question, if God is in time in your model, and it's before the creation of the universe, but God is in time, why did God wait so long to create the universe? The famous Leibniz question.
Right, right. So if you...
why did he create it at this moment rather than eons ago?
Eons earlier, yeah. So if you have if you believe, so a lot of these people who raised the question, like Leibniz and even earlier, they believed that nothing happens without a reason, and especially God never acts without a reason. So if he chose a particular time, then there must have been a good reason for it. Now, if nothing existed and there was just instants or periods, it's hard to see any reason to pick one rather than another. So you might imagine that God was sort of anticipating creation. My friend Brian Leftow has proposed that maybe there was a point where anticipation reached a certain level, and that was the. On the other hand, you might think that this is the wrong way to think about God and his choices. You might think God could really be free to choose between perfectly good alternatives and choose one just for the heck of it. Now, one thing you can say about that sort of quasi-time before creation, you could say, look, it has length, but there's no fact about how long it is, and it doesn't even have parts. And so there's no question of picking one part of it rather than another. Now, that's a bit hard to wrap one's mind around, but I think it may not be impossible to get the hang of a period that is lengthy in the sense that it's not instantaneous. And God is alive in it. God has thoughts. These thoughts have length, but no particular length. and there's no beginning to it. If there could be such a period, then there would be no question of stopping it sooner or later.